Welcome back to part 4 of our Unity RTS with the new entity component system. In the previous video, we covered selecting and moving our units. In this one, we actually get some highlighting going, and we add the base of our physics, which is using axis-aligned bounding boxes. Don't let that scare you. It's pretty simple. Really, we're just going to have some kind of box that's following our player that tracks our collision. So this is to prevent them from running into each other. I don't have that in this video, but we're going to set up the basics, what we need for that. So let's get started. And we'll switch over to the project that we left over from part 3. And so to make the highlight, we need two things. We need to spawn it from a prefab, which will use the same paradigm as the unit spawner that Unity has in their examples. And then we're going to need a highlight component that kind of tags what needs to be highlighted and things like that. So let's just do a bunch of copying right now. So let's just call this highlight spawner. I just Control-D on unit spawner. We'll eventually add the highlight spawner, but for now, just remove, and everything else should be the same. And then we're going to need two components. We're going to need a unit spawner, well, a highlight spawner component, which will be the same as the unit spawner, and that's going to contain our prefab. Similar. If you're not familiar with this, check out part 3. We cover that in there. So highlight spawner component. And as I said before, we need just a highlight script that is just a component that will be kind of act as like our tagging. And you'll see what I mean once we dive into it a little bit. So let's just start with the highlight component, since that will be. There's nothing about this. It's just component data, and we just add using Unity entities, and that's it. This is purely for tagging purposes. Okay, and then we made a highlight spawner. There it is. And this will work the same as the unit spawner. All we're gonna do is make a spawner archetype that's just gonna have like a sphere and some color, some green coloring. If I learn how to copy and paste. Okay, cool. Okay, so that's looking good. So now we can make the system. So let's go back to Unity. Oops, wrong project. And I'm just gonna call this the selecting system. If it makes more sense in your game to call it something else, feel free to do that. The reason why I'm not just doing like a unit spawner system is because this is actually gonna like select our character and do more than just spawning the highlight. So let's make a component system, because we're gonna actually interact a lot with the entity manager. And so for now, I feel like I want to change it up. Instead of we've been doing a lot of jobs, let's just do some component system, and it's easier to make multiple component groups in that. So what do we need when we're selecting a unit? Well, we need the selected units that we're going to attach our highlights to, and then the highlight itself to instance state. So I'm just going to copy and paste these two component groups. So this is what we're going to query for, and we're going to have two distinct units for that. And how we grab that is we override the onCreateManager. So I'm going to paste that in, and mHighlights get component group, so of the highlight spawner, which we made, and we're going to add to that empty game object that we had. And in here, we're going to grab the selected units, which, as you remember before in our player unit select, that's the component, player unit select system, when we add something, we just add player unit select. That's how we know a player unit is selected. So we want to grab everyone that's selected and of type selecting. So selecting is another tagging component that we'll need to make. The reason being is when we add a player unit select, we want to keep them selecting, but we don't want to keep adding a new highlight every single frame to all these player unit selects. So we need some way to just only do it once. And I kind of struggled with a way to to do that, and the best way was just to have a tagging component, which Unity does recommend you should do. And what we will do is we'll add this in the player unit select system eventually, and over here we remove that component once we're done with it. So thus the highlight is only added once. So let's go ahead and make that component real quick. Actually, we can probably, I think the highlight component, let's just Control D, save time, and let's just change this to selecting component. Okay. So actually, I'm just going to call it selecting. Normally, you only do the component is when you're doing this public class. We're not going to be doing that, so public struct selecting. Remember to change it to struct. That will get you. That got me a couple times. And then we'll just change this to highlight. Okay, cool. So we have our highlight component that just contains our highlight, and then selecting component that contains a struct of selecting. Okay, cool. So now we can get back to our selecting system, and now we have our two groups, our two distinct groups. So now we got to make our on update, and I'm just going to paste that code, and we're going to walk through it. It's a lot of code, so might be easier to do a walkthrough. Now there's nothing here that is completely new. Everything here can be you've probably seen before, but we're going to walk through each just in case. So this using statement was in Unite, in Unity's Unite, and basically it allows you to use this entity array, and it automatically cleans up for you. So this is really good for really convenient way to parse through the entity arrays that we're getting through these components. I just stack them on top of each other so that we basically can use both in here. Nothing crazy about it. Selected units and highlights, and then we run the for each. So this is similar to the system we had in our unit spawner system. Oh, keep clicking that. We have our using statement and then our for each, and then we iterate within it. So nothing crazy new here, but we'll continue it. Lost myself. Okay, cool. So we iterate through the selected units because we know we only have one highlight actually. I'll probably get some comments about this, but this is a little hacky, but as of right now, this was the best way I could kind of deal with it, so to speak. I didn't know the right way to do it, but in future videos we'll probably refactor this. But in any case, we go through all the units that have been selected, and they are in the process of being selected. So selecting, and we grabbed our shared component data from the highlight spawner. We grab the prefab, which will be our highlight prefab. We instantiate that, so each highlight that we have is actually its own entity. Now, this might not be efficient, but some people really wanted to know how to use the transform system or the attach system. And so I figured, this is a perfect example to kind of showcase how to use attach. If you want to know more about the transform system, Unity says basically you can attach things. The only requirement is it needs to have one of either a position, rotation, or scale. And then basically what it does is adds a local to world system state component data to your child that basically follows the unit. So we don't actually have to update our position or anything like that. We can just attach it and it'll follow it forever. They have more into custom and transforms, and as you can see right here, attaching transformations is you use a new entity that takes a parent and a child. So this will be our selected unit and then our highlight. And then it does some magic in the background. And right here is once it's done, it's attached parent, and local to parent components will be associated with the child entity. So it's going to have these three new components added to it. And to detach it, from the parent, we just have to remove that attached, and then it basically can fly off on its own. We're going to destroy it. We don't want to, but let's say you have a car and it's going down and you have all these attachments, and when you have a collision you want them to be detached. So you just remove this attach and then they'll start flying off in their own things and all that kind of cool stuff. We won't, maybe in the next series we'll do some car stuff, but for now we're just going to stick with just a simple attach. So back to here, make our prefab. This is our highlight entity, our new highlight entity, and we're gonna create the new entity of attach. And remember, this one will be destroyed after it does its attach work. And then basically for this entity, which is our highlight entity, we set a position and scale. Now, this might seem weird, right? Because we are just 0, negative 0.5, and 0 for a highlight. Well, how does that work? When you attach an entity, it's relative to the parent. So we don't actually need to worry about where this is in the world. We just need to worry about where it is relative to the parent. And I know my little cubes are a scale of 1. So the center is 0.5. So to get it on the bottom, I just need to go on the y-axis, negative 0.5. Everything else zeroed out. Scale, nothing crazy here. 2, I just make them a little bit bigger than the box, and then I flatten the stuff so it has that nice looking highlight, and then I attach it. So here's this attach that we just made, and in here, parent is our selected unit, child is our entity. And then at the end, we remove the selecting from our selected unit, so it only ever runs once. Okay, so now the final thing to do before we can test this is we need to add our selecting when we're in the process of actually selecting a unit for the first time. So we go to our player unit select system, and in our little selected function, we're going to add a new line, and it's going to be the same thing, except we're also adding a selecting. And that should be it. So now we can go back to Unity, and in our highlight spawner, we're going to add our, highlight spawner component, and it takes prefab, which we don't have yet. We're gonna do the tried and true copy, and then we're gonna do highlight arc type. And in this arc type, we're gonna remove a bunch of stuff. So we don't need a nav agent. We don't need this nav agent. We don't need the player input. And we do want a position, and we actually do want a scale component. We don't need to copy initial transform because we're going to set that ourselves within the system. So we just need a position and scale, because remember we set that up quickly going there. In our selecting system, we set component data on the position and scale. So we want to make sure we have those to our archetype. And then finally, we'll add a highlight. Oh, we actually don't want to do that yet. Wait, we forgot one thing. We forgot to change the render mesh. So we want to use a sphere for now. And then in our player unit mat, we're going to make a new copy. We're going to call it highlight mat. And it's going to be nice green. Okay, and then in our archetype, open prefab, and then we can just select our new highlight mat. Okay, cool. So now, when we press play, we should be able to select, and then the unit will show up. Now, if you've been paying attention, you would know that I didn't actually add it to our highlight spawner, and that's why it's throwing a null reference exception. If you're smarter than me, congratulations. But now we can press play, and it should be good to go. Alright, so we now see the component. It's looking good. Just zoom in here just to make sure. So as I repeated before, we know that the center was 0.5, and so we just went negative 0.5. Your model might be different, depends how you calculate your height maps. But for now, we're just going to keep it simple so we can focus on the ECS parts of it. Cool. So we got the selecting, but actually if I press play again, we don't have deselecting. So that's a whole nother system actually, because if we click outside, nothing happens. So let's go deal with that. But before I just blurt out the solution, let's first understand what's happening. So how we worked with when we added the highlight, we added a new selecting, and then in the selecting system, we look for any player units that have this select and they're in the middle of selecting. And then we go ahead and generate all our stuff. Now when we're deselecting, we can't just do that because one, we've attached the highlight, so there's no, like, the highlight doesn't know that the player unit this got removed, and there's no easy way to do this. So we'll need some kind of new deselecting, and then the second difficult part is in the highlight spawner, our highlight archetype. This is not an easy way to denote this highlight. Like, there's no easy way to kind of filter only this component, and that's where our if you remember, we made our highlight component, the struct here. That's where we're going to need to add our highlight component, which we just had it as a struct, but let's make it available in the Unity. So let's go highlight component, and it's component data wrapper, highlight. Okay, so and this tagging system is in the advanced Boyd demo from Unity. So I think it's kosher for now to use, but basically we'll go to our highlight archetype. Remember, not the spawner itself, but the archetype. This is what we're actually adding to the thing, and we'll add our highlight component. So now we can make a system that only targets this highlight component. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's see. We'll make a new C# script, and we'll do deselect system. And let's open that up. And I'm actually just going to copy and paste from my sample project to save me fumbling around typing all the stuff, and then we can kind of walk through it as we've done in the previous examples. So deselect system, it's a component system. I do like component systems. You can use a job system as well. There's no difference here. I'm just changing it up so you guys can get comfortable integrating both systems. On our create manager, you'll notice that we don't only have highlight here, but we have a type of attached. Now, if you recall in the docs, attached is attached to the child, which is when we made that entity in the player unit select system. Oh, not sorry, the selecting system. When we make an attach here, this entity basically adds an attached and sets the parent on this child, and then this deletes itself. So we want to make sure we only target the highlights of attached. I don't know why, but if your system has some kind of highlights floating off by themselves, I'm not one to judge, but we're only going to remove the highlights that are attached, and so that's why we have both of those. And then in the update, pretty simple. We just get all the attached highlights that we found, and for each of those highlights, we get the component data. We get the parent, which, remember, in the attached system sets the parent. So we know that this is the unit select, the player unit. And then we didn't make this deselecting tag yet, but this will be super similar to all the other tags we've been using. But basically, we check if the parent has the deselecting. If so, we remove it from the parent, and then we destroy the highlighting entity. So only a couple more things to do. Let's go to component, and I'm actually gonna just Control D this highlight component, and then we're gonna just call it deselect component. Deselecting. I think I named it deselecting. Yeah, deselecting. So I'll rename that after. And since we're using this for tagging, we don't actually need this. Or sorry, we're only going to tag it in the editor. We don't need to worry about that. And now we can check if that. The final thing is we have to actually add this deselecting, which we can do in our player unit select system. Very similar to this, so I'm just going to copy. So when we remove this player unit select, we want to make sure we add a deselecting to flag that system to to turn on, and we should be good to go. So now this will check if this is not, I wouldn't say this is optimized yet, because we're always going to be running this in all the highlights that are attached. So if you have 1,000 highlighted characters, this is constantly checking if the deselecting is running on the parent. In the future, we might optimize it so we turn on the system only sometimes,
but we'll see in the future. I like to kind of get something working, and then sometimes you can see the patterns come from the woodwork. So let's do this. Alright, highlighting is good. We click out and it's deselecting successfully. And if we look in the entity debugger, entity manager, there's only 3 0 as a spawner, and then our 2 units here. So it's successfully deleting, and we're not just crazily adding stuff. And if we swap, we only can ever have 1 highlighted at a time, so that's looking good. And that's pretty much it. That's highlighting and selecting. We kind of covered some new stuff, like the attach system, and how to use the component system in conjunction with the job systems. I was going to cover collisions in this video, but I think maybe this video is running a little long, and we'll probably cover that in the next video, as there's maybe we'll dive into some deep physics of how that works. So hopefully you guys have been liking these videos, and I guess like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.